The Galactic Council accused humanity of violations. Then the evidence emerged. The transmission arrived without warning. Not on a military frequency. Not through the encrypted diplomatic channels that Earth's Interstellar Relations Bureau had spent 11 years carefully negotiating with the Galactic Accord. It arrived on a public broadcast band, the equivalent of shouting something in the middle of a crowded marketplace, simultaneously decoded and distributed across every registered species network in the known galaxy. It was, by any measure, a deliberate humiliation. Formal notice of violation issued by the Galactic Accord Council of 9 recipient, the United Earth Government, Sol System, Sector 7 Gamma Classification, Tier 1 Breach, Crimes Against Sovereign Populations. Commander Yara Osei read the document 3 times before she trusted her own eyes. She was standing in the Situation Room of UHQ Orbital, Earth's primary military coordination hub position at the L2 Lagrange point. Around her, 37 analysts moved with quiet precision across their terminals, but the usual background hum of operational chatter had gone completely silent. Everyone had seen the broadcast. Everyone was reading the same words. "They're saying we conducted unauthorized military operations in the Kepler 442 corridor," said Lieutenant Farhan Malik, her intelligence officer, his voice carefully neutral. "Specifically, they're accusing us of deploying an armed fleet into neutral Veth space, attacking a civilian convoy, and destroying 3 registered Accord observation posts." Yara set the document down on the table. When did this supposedly happen? The dates cited are between March and June of last year. Malik pulled up a star chart. During Operation Long Watch. The room went colder than the recycled air could explain. Operation Long Watch had been Earth's longest deep space monitoring mission to date. 14 months, 7 research vessels, no weapon systems beyond standard point defense. Its entire mandate had been passive observation of stellar formation activity near the Kepler corridor. Not a single live weapon had been authorized. Yara herself had signed the mission parameters. "They're not requesting a hearing," said Admiral Quan Sungjin, Earth's senior military commander, who had entered the room quietly enough that no one noticed until he spoke. He was a compact man with silver hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent 40 years learning that panic was a resource you could not afford to waste. "They've already issued the verdict. The fine is 40 billion credits in reparations, a mandatory reduction of Earth's patrol fleet by 60%, and a 5-year suspension from Accord trade corridors." Yara looked at him. "They're not even asking our side." "No." Quan moved to the central display table and pulled up the Accord Charter, the 900-page document humanity had spent 2 decades studying, negotiating, and ultimately signing. He scrolled without hurry until he found the relevant clause. Article 77, Section C. In cases of Tier 1 violations, the Council of 9 is empowered to issue provisional sanctions while evidence review is conducted. Provisional, technically. But the sanctions take effect in 72 hours regardless of the review timeline. Which means we're already punished before we've said a word. "Welcome to galactic diplomacy." He said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse. Outside, through the reinforced viewport, Earth turned slowly in the dark. From this distance, you could see the Terminator line, the sharp boundary between daylight and shadow, sweeping across the African continent. Yara had grown up in Accra. She remembered being a child and watching the ocean and thinking the horizon was the edge of everything. She understood now that it wasn't even the beginning. When first contact had come 18 years ago, it had not been the gleaming, cinematic moment most people imagined. There had been no single alien ship descending through clouds, no dramatic broadcast, no universal translator clicking on like a light switch. There had been a signal, faint, structured, unmistakably artificial, detected by a joint ESA-ISRO deep field array in the outer solar system. Then 2 years of mathematics and silence. Then a physical envoy, small and formal, arriving in a vessel the size of a commercial airliner, carrying a data package the size of a novel. The package was the Accord Charter. Humanity had essentially been handed a membership application to a civilization structure that had been operating for roughly 4,000 years. The Accord had 41 member species. It had trade laws, territorial protocols, a shared judicial framework, and a military oversight body called the Council of 9, 9 senior species who rotated through positions of authority on 50-year terms. Humans had read the charter carefully. They had asked questions. They had negotiated 17 amendments. They had signed. What no one had told them, what no one had been required to tell them, was that membership in the Accord came with the assumption of guilt in contested situations. The legal philosophy underpinning Article 77 was rooted in Veth jurisprudence. which operated on the principle that destabilizing actions required immediate restraint regardless of intent. You stopped the bleeding first. You asked questions later. In practice, it meant that any Accord member could file a Tier 1 violation against any other member, trigger immediate provisional sanctions, and force the accused to spend months or years proving their innocence while already suffering the consequences. It was not, strictly speaking, unjust by the standards that had built it. It was, by human standards, deeply familiar. Bureaucratic power deployed as a weapon. Who filed it? Yara asked. Malik hesitated, which told her more than the answer that followed. Primary signatories are the Veth Sovereignty, the Draven Collective, and the Marin Confederacy. But the investigation request came from a subbody we haven't seen before. A monitoring group called the Accord Frontier Compliance Division. It was apparently chartered 8 months ago. 8 months ago. Yara did the math without thinking. Right around the time we submitted our application for expanded patrol rights in the Kepler corridor. No one in the room said anything. They didn't need to. This was not justice. It was strategy. Someone in the Accord had decided that humanity's growing presence in the Kepler corridor represented an inconvenience, or perhaps a threat to existing economic arrangements, and had engineered a legal mechanism to curtail it. The charges were the tool. The sanctions were the goal. Yara understood this. She was also aware that understanding it and proving it were two entirely different problems. What do we actually have from Operation Longwatch? She asked. Malik pulled up a directory. Everything. Full telemetry from all 7 vessels. Navigation logs, sensor sweeps, crew communications, power consumption records. Every second of 14 months is documented, time-stamped, and archived in both our systems and the Accord's mandatory mission registry. Yara looked at Quan. Quan looked at the Earth through the viewport. Then we have work to do, he said quietly. 72 hours before the sanctions activate. We file a formal counter-evidence request. We contact our diplomatic liaisons with the Theron and the Solundi, they're the 2 council members most likely to be neutral, and we begin building an evidentiary case that is so thorough, so complete, and so irrefutable that the council has no choice but to reverse the verdict publicly. He paused. We don't fight this with anger. We don't fight it with threats. We fight it the same way they attacked us, with documentation. With patience. He straightened slightly. And if someone inside the Accord fabricated evidence against 14 months of human deep space operations, then somewhere in the gap between what they claim happened and what our records show actually happened, that's where we'll find them. Yara nodded once. She pulled up her terminal and began to work. There is a particular kind of institutional tedium that military researchers understand and almost no one else appreciates. It is the discipline of recording everything, not because anyone expects the records to matter, but because the moment you stop recording is precisely when they will. Every mission parameter, every system diagnostic, every crew status report, every navigational microcorrection fed into the inertial guidance system at 2-minute intervals. Every meal scheduled and logged. Every maintenance request filed and time-stamped. Every communication between ships, encrypted and archived. Every sensor sweep of surrounding space, stored in triplicate across isolated backup drives. Dr. Amara Solis had spent 11 months of Operation Longwatch desperately bored. She was the mission's lead astrophysicist, a compact, meticulous woman from Buenos Aires who had spent her career studying stellar nurseries and had lobbied aggressively for a posting on Longwatch because the Kepler 442 corridor offered the best unobstructed view of a Class G formation event that would not repeat for another 800 years. She had brought 47 terabytes of personal instrument calibration data, a 6-month supply of yerba mate, and the professional patience of someone who understood that the universe revealed itself slowly, and only to those willing to wait. She had been back on Earth for 4 months when Yara's team contacted her at 0340 local time. I need everything, Yara said without preamble. You have everything, Amara said. She was already awake. The news had broken on every channel 6 hours ago. It was filed with the Accord mission registry before we even reached the return corridor. Standard protocol. Every vessel's complete operational record. I know what was filed. I need the raw data. The unprocessed telemetry. The source files before the mission package was compiled. Pause. Why? Because someone is claiming our ships were in 3 different locations conducting military operations during a period when I can prove, using your navigational logs, that they were positioned in stellar observation formation 2.4 light hours from the nearest Veth territorial marker. The compiled mission package will show that. But compiled packages can be challenged, they're processed, formatted, filtered for relevance. I need the raw stream that feeds into those packages. The kind of data that's too granular and too voluminous for anyone to plausibly fabricate. Another pause. Longer. Commander, Amara said carefully, are you telling me someone manufactured evidence against us? I'm telling you I don't know yet. And I won't know until I can compare what they're claiming against data that existed before they made the claim. The Accord's charges against humanity rested on 3 specific incidents. The first alleged incident was the interdiction of a Veth civilian convoy in the outer Kepler corridor on March 14 of the previous year, 2 Earth vessels supposedly moving to intercept a registered transport carrying agricultural equipment and aid supplies to a colony in the disputed buffer zone. The convoy's escort reported being approached, scanned and threatened before the Earth vessels withdrew. The second was the destruction of a remote monitoring station operated by the Accord's Frontier Compliance Division, the same newly chartered body that had filed the violation. The station, designated FC-7, had reportedly been struck by focused energy discharge consistent with Earth naval weaponry on April 3. No crew had been aboard, but the destruction of an Accord facility carried automatic Tier 1 status under the charter. The third incident was the most serious. On June 9, an Accord patrol vessel from the Draven Collective had documented what it described as 2 Earth warships conducting an unauthorized armed sweep of neutral Marin space, probing Marin's outer sensor net in a pattern consistent with pre-conflict reconnaissance. The patrol captain's report described the Earth vessels as moving in a tactical formation, running minimal identification signals, and withdrawing only when the Draven patrol made direct contact. 3 incidents. March, April, June. Spanning the exact operational window of Long Watch. It was, from a legal architecture standpoint, impressively constructed. The incidents were spaced far enough apart to suggest sustained behavior rather than isolated error. The locations were in a region where humanity's deep space presence was minimal and documentation sparse. The witnesses were all Accord members in good standing. And the Frontier Compliance Division, the body that had filed the complaint, had been specifically chartered to oversee precisely this kind of territorial behavior. Yara had been a military intelligence analyst before she became a commander. She had spent 8 years studying how state actors fabricated casus belli, the Latin phrase that meant, approximately, the cause for which we start a war. She had studied the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the Gleiwitz operation, the manipulation of satellite imagery in a dozen mid-century conflicts. She knew what manufactured evidence looked like when it was well done. This was well done. But it had a problem. The problem was Amara Solis's stellar nursery. The formation event in the Kepler 442 corridor, technically designated KIC 7341, had been the entire scientific justification for Long Watch. And because Amara Solis was a serious scientist with a deep professional investment in her data, she had run her sensor instruments continuously, without interruption for the entire 14 months of the mission. Not hourly. Not on a scheduled sweep cycle. Continuously. Her equipment logged the electromagnetic environment of the surrounding corridor every 4 seconds. This included, incidentally, everything within sensor range of the Long Watch formation: navigational transponders, energy signatures, mass displacement readings, and gravitational microvariations consistent with propulsion systems. Her data didn't care about military significance. It recorded everything with the indifferent thoroughness of a machine designed to miss nothing. On March 14, according to the Accord's charges, 2 Earth vessels had been moving to intercept a civilian convoy 1.4 light hours from the Long Watch formation's primary observation position. On March 14, according to Amara's continuous sensor log, the navigational transponder signatures of all 7 Long Watch vessels were recorded at their observation coordinates every 4 seconds, without a single interruption for the entire 24-hour period. The gravitational signatures were consistent with stationary positioning. There were no propulsion energy readings consistent with significant displacement. The vessels had not moved. They could not have been in 2 places simultaneously. It was not a spectacular revelation. It was not dramatic. It was a 14-month-long record of nothing unusual happening, maintained by a scientist who had been bored and meticulous in equal measure, producing data that happened to make the Accord's chronology physically impossible. It's not enough by itself, said Lieutenant Malik, reviewing the first analysis with Yara at 0600 the following morning. He looked like he hadn't slept because he hadn't. They'll argue instrument calibration error, signal interference, data integrity. We need corroboration. We have it. Yara pulled up a second dataset. Long Watch filed mandatory position reports with the Accord's own mission registry at 6-hour intervals. Registry confirmed and time-stamped each report. The registry is administered by the Accord Secretariat, not by us. They can't argue we falsified their own records. Malik studied the display. If we can get an independent technical body to cross-reference Solis's sensor logs against the Accord's own registry timestamps, then we have machine-generated confirmation from their own system that our ships were where we said they were. Yara nodded. Which means either the Accord's registry is corrupted, which is an extraordinary claim that will require them to investigate their own infrastructure, or the 3 incidents never involved our vessels. What about the FC-7 station destruction? Yara's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile. The kind of look that comes when a piece of a puzzle drops into place and reveals something unexpected. That's the interesting one, she said. Because according to the Accord's own registration database, which I had our attaché access through standard diplomatic channels last night, Station FC-7 was commissioned 8 months ago. She paused. And according to the structural survey logged at commissioning, its rated service life before scheduled decommissioning is 6 months. Malik went still. It was already scheduled for decommissioning, he said slowly. Before it was allegedly destroyed. 2 months before. Yara closed the file. Someone destroyed a station that was already going to be removed, and then reported the destruction to a compliance body they had just created, to justify charges they had already prepared. She looked at the star chart. This wasn't improvised. This was planned. The room was quiet. Outside Earth still turned. The Terminator line had moved west. Dawn was crossing the Atlantic. They had 61 hours before the sanctions activated. Yara sent 3 secure messages. One to Amara Solis, requesting formal affidavit certification of the sensor logs. One to Earth's diplomatic attaché to the Accord Secretariat, requesting a formal technical audit of the mission registry records. One to a retired Accord jurist named Sarah Vale, a Theran national whose 30-year record on the Accord's own appellate bench made her the closest thing to a neutral authority that existed in this process. Then she began drafting the counter-submission. The Accord's legal secretariat operated out of a station orbiting Threshold Prime, a vast, deliberately neutral installation positioned at the gravitational midpoint between the 3 oldest Accord member territories. It was an architectural statement as much as a functional facility. Enormous, unhurried, built to process the slow machinery of interstellar governance across timescales that made human bureaucracy look impulsive. The average processing time for a formal counter-submission to a Tier 1 violation was 42 standard days. Earth filed theirs in 51 hours. The submission was 2,340 pages. It included complete navigational telemetry for all 7 Long Watch vessels across the full 427-day mission period, certified by mission commanders under oath. It included Amara Solis's continuous sensor logs with full instrument calibration records and independent technical verification from 3 Earth-based astrophysics institutions. It included the Accord's own mission registry timestamps, obtained through legitimate diplomatic channels, carrying the Secretariat's own authentication codes, cross-referenced against every claimed incident with a point-by-point chronological impossibility analysis. It included the decommissioning schedule for Station FC-7. And it included something that Yara had found at 0200 on the final night, running through the structural detail of the Compliance Division's charging document with the focused, sleepless attention of someone who knew that precision errors were where cases broke open. The charging document cited sensor data from an Accord Frontier Compliance vessel, designation AFCV Meridian, which had allegedly recorded Earth naval energy signatures at the June 9 incident site. The data was appended as Exhibit 14, 40 pages of formatted sensor readings showing what the filing described as unambiguous propulsion and weapons signatures consistent with Earth naval architecture. Yara had pulled the AFCV Meridian's registration record from the public Accord vessel database, available to any member state's diplomatic mission, unrestricted. AFCV Meridian had been commissioned 5 months ago. Its designated patrol territory was the Inner Accord Administrative Zone, 14 light-years from the Kepler corridor. It had no filed mission logs showing deployment to the Kepler region. None. Not a transit record, not a fuel consumption filing, not a crew rotation notice. Under Accord Charter Article 34, all patrol vessels operating outside their designated territory were required to file a territorial deployment notice with the Secretariat within 48 hours of crossing a sector boundary. No notice had been filed for AFCV Meridian, which meant that either the vessel had violated Accord regulations to reach the June 9 incident site, making the Compliance Division guilty of the same type of territorial breach they were charging humanity with, or the vessel had never been there at all, and Exhibit 14 was fabricated. Yara included a formal request for AFCV Meridian's complete mission log under Article 41's evidence discovery provisions. She expected the request to take weeks to process. It took 4 hours to generate a response, which was itself significant, because Accord legal responses did not move in 4 hours unless someone was paying close attention. The response declined to provide the log, citing an active operational security classification. Yara read it twice, then forwarded it to Sarah Vale with a single line of annotation. They know. Sarah Vale was 73 years old by Theran reckoning, roughly equivalent to a human in their mid-50s, given the species' longer developmental arc, and she had spent her career as one of the Accord's most respected appellate jurists before retiring to an academic post studying comparative legal frameworks between member species. She had agreed to serve as Earth's independent legal advisor for one reason she had stated plainly in their first communication. I have spent 30 years watching the Article 77 provisional sanction mechanism be misused by member states with economic and territorial interests and outcomes. I agreed to sign the charter amendments that were supposed to prevent this. I would like to know whether they are being ignored. She was not warm. She was not friendly. She was, in Yara's estimation, precisely what they needed. A Theran withstanding inside the Accord's legal culture, no financial connection to any of the charging parties, and a professional reputation that made her difficult to dismiss. When she received Yara's counter-submission, she read it in 8 hours. She sent back 3 pages of notes identifying the 4 strongest evidentiary points, the 2 weakest arguments that needed reinforcement, and a single paragraph at the end that read, "The operational security classification placed on AFCV Meridian's mission logs is, under Charter Article 41, subsection 7, legally inapplicable to evidence submitted in an active Tier 1 proceeding. The Council Secretariat knows this. The fact that they applied it anyway suggests either significant internal pressure from the charging parties or direct involvement of Council staff in the construction of this filing. I recommend requesting an emergency session with the Theran and Salundi Council members before the sanctions activate. I will make the initial contact." The sanctions were scheduled to activate at 0900 Accord Standard Time on the 3rd day. At 0700, the Theran Council member, a senior diplomat named Counselor Adeth, who had served on the Accord's judicial oversight body for 22 years, formally requested a procedural delay of sanction activation pending technical evidence review. Under Article 77's own provisions, a delay could be granted if a sitting council member formally certified that the evidence in the counter-submission raised sufficient procedural questions to warrant independent assessment. Adeth certified it. The Draven and Veth representatives immediately filed objections. The Marin Confederacy's representative abstained without comment, which was itself unusual enough to register. The remaining 5 council members held their positions and waited, which in Accord political culture meant they were paying close attention and committing to nothing. The delay was granted. 48 hours. In the Situation Room at UHQ Orbital, Lieutenant Malik watched the notification come through and let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 3 days. "That's not a win," Yara said before he could say anything. "That's a pause. They haven't reversed anything. It's 48 more hours. Which we use." She was already at her terminal. The operational security block on Meridian's logs is the key. If we can get an independent technical body to formally certify that the block is legally inapplicable under Article 41, it forces the Secretariat to either release the logs or acknowledge they're withholding evidence in an active proceeding. Either way, it becomes a story about the Compliance Division's conduct, not ours. And if the logs show what we think they show? Yara considered the question carefully. If the sensor data in Exhibit 14 doesn't match AFCV Meridian's actual operational record, if the vessel was never in the Kepler corridor and cannot have generated the readings attributed to it, then we're not looking at a badly constructed legal case. She paused. We're looking at coordinated fraud committed by registered Accord members using official compliance infrastructure. That's not a violation of Accord trade law. That's an attack on the Charter itself. Malik was quiet for a moment. How many species in the Accord have territorial or economic interests in limiting human expansion into the Kepler corridor? We've identified 11 potential parties. Yara looked at the star chart. The Kepler corridor marked in pale green, Earth's patrol boundary marked in blue, the cluster of Veth, Draven and Marin territorial claims arranged like a wall. But interest and involvement are different things. We can't make accusations we can't prove. What we can do is present an evidentiary record so complete that the Accord's own legal framework requires it to investigate the charging parties. She pulled up the draft of their next filing, a formal Article 41 evidence disclosure demand, directed not to the Compliance Division but to the Accord Secretariat directly, with a copy forwarded to all 9 council members simultaneously. "We make it impossible to ignore," she said. "And then we let the Accord's own institutions do what they were designed to do." She sent the filing. Then she made coffee, sat down and waited. The leak did not come from Earth. That was the first thing Yara established when the AFCV Meridian's mission logs appeared in her secure inbox at 0340 on the 5th day of the proceeding, 17 hours before the extended review period was scheduled to expire. The file was large, unformatted, still carrying the Secretariat's internal metadata headers, and attached to a message with no sender identification. Just a routing code that, when her team traced it, resolved to a public data terminal on Threshold Prime's civilian administrative level. Someone inside the Accord had sent it. Yara sat with that fact for 60 seconds before she opened the file. The AFCV Meridian's complete mission log covered 5 months of operational activity. The first 4 months were exactly what the vessel's registration suggested they should be: routine patrol activity in the inner administrative zone, standard reporting intervals, nothing outside designated territorial boundaries. The log was precise, unremarkable, and consistent with a newly commissioned compliance vessel running its initial operational period. Then came month 5. For a period of 22 days in the month preceding the Tier 1 filing, AFCV Meridian's log showed something that should not have been possible to miss and was therefore, clearly, never meant to be seen. The vessel's navigational record showed it stationed at coordinates in the inner Accord zone. Standard patrol. Nothing unusual. But the power consumption records, the raw engineering logs that tracked energy draw from every system aboard, told a different story. The sensor array had been operating at full active scan capacity for extended periods. The communication system had logged outgoing transmissions on encrypted diplomatic frequencies, the kind used for inter-council correspondence, not compliance vessel operations. And most significantly, the vessel's long-range data transmission system had logged the transfer of a 40-page formatted sensor data package to a Frontier Compliance Division server, on a date 11 days before the Compliance Division had officially received the Tier 1 filing they claimed to have conducted independently. The sensor data in Exhibit 14 had been created and transmitted to the Compliance Division before the Compliance Division filed its investigation. Yara read that line of the log 3 times. Then she called Sarah Vale. "They preloaded the evidence," Vale said. She sounded, for the first time in their acquaintance, genuinely shaken. Not dramatically, Atheron's composure ran deep, but there was a quality to her voice that Yara had not heard before. The sound of an experienced legal mind confronting something outside its model of the possible. They created the sensor data package, transferred it to the Compliance Division, and then had the Compliance Division open a formal investigation that would produce the pre-existing evidence as a discovery finding. The investigation was the laundering mechanism. Yes. And the station FC-7. Scheduled for decommissioning. Destroyed on a timeline that fit the case they needed to build. Whether it was destroyed deliberately or whether they used a decommissioning that was already planned as a convenient data point, I don't know yet. But either way, it wasn't destroyed by us. Vale was quiet for a moment. Counselor Adeth needs to see this before the review period expires. I know. But I have a problem. Yara leaned back in her chair. This file came through an anonymous terminal. If I submit it as evidence in the formal proceeding, the charging parties will challenge the provenance. They'll argue it's fabricated, that Earth manufactured the leak to cast doubt on legitimate evidence. I need independent certification of the file's authenticity before it can carry weight in the proceeding. The metadata headers are original Secretariat format, which we could have copied. The transmission timestamps, which we could have spoofed. Vale paused. You need the Secretariat to confirm the log is authentic. I need the Secretariat to pull their own copy of AFCV Meridian's mission log, their original archived version, the one that would have been filed automatically through the Accord's mandatory mission reporting system, and verify that it matches what I received. If it matches, the log is authentic and the discrepancy between the navigational record and the power consumption data is the Accord's own finding, not ours. And if the Secretariat's archived copy has been altered? Yara had thought about this. Then we have an even larger problem. One that goes well beyond this proceeding. Counselor Adetha's response to the evidence package arrived in 6 hours. It was formally worded, measured, and careful. The language of a diplomat who understood that what they were reading was incendiary and was choosing each word accordingly. But the substance was clear. A death had reviewed the preliminary material, found sufficient procedural irregularity to warrant an emergency technical audit of AFCV Meridian's archived mission logs by the Accord's independent data verification body, and was formally requesting a suspension of the review period pending the audit's completion. The suspension request required support from at least 2 council members to activate. The Solundi representative, who had been silent since the proceeding began, added their support within the hour. The Marin Confederacy representative, whose earlier abstention had registered as unusual, formally recused themselves from the proceeding, citing a conflict of interest they declined to specify. A conflict of interest they declined to specify. In Accord legal culture, formal recusal on conflict grounds was a significant act. It was the kind of move a member made when they were aware of something that made their participation compromised, and when they chose institutional integrity over solidarity with the charging parties. Yara noted it and filed it for later. The independent technical audit took 11 days. They were, in Yara's experience, among the longest 11 days she had endured, not because of inaction, but because of the peculiar tension of having done everything correctly and being required to wait for an external process to confirm it. Her team spent the time building secondary documentation, a complete comparative analysis of the 3 alleged incident sites against Longwatch's sensor coverage, demonstrating that 2 of the 3 sites had been within passive detection range of Amara's instruments and would have generated anomalous readings if the events described had actually occurred. They prepared a technical brief on the Frontier Compliance Division's chartering process, mapping the timeline of its creation against the timeline of Earth's application for expanded Kepler corridor patrol rights. The picture that emerged was not subtle. Earth had submitted the patrol rights application 14 months ago. 7 months later, the Frontier Compliance Division was chartered, ostensibly to improve monitoring of territorial adherence in frontier regions, with no specific connection to Earth cited in its founding documents. 4 months after that, with Longwatch still in the field and the patrol rights application still under review, the division had apparently begun constructing the evidentiary framework for a Tier 1 violation charge. 2 months before the violation was filed, Station FC-7 was decommissioned on schedule, or destroyed, the distinction mattering less than its usefulness to the narrative. The violation was filed. The sanctions were demanded. Humanity was expected to pay, reduce its fleet, and withdraw from the Kepler corridor discussion for 5 years. By which point, presumably, the patrol rights application would be moot. The audit results were delivered to all 9 council members simultaneously. The Accord's independent data verification body, a standing technical institution with no member state affiliation, staffed by specialists from 7 different species, had pulled the Secretariat's archived copy of AFCV Meridian's mission log and compared it against the version that had been filed with the formal proceeding as Exhibit 14. The archived log and the exhibit version were not the same file. The navigational records matched. The standard operational data matched. But the sensor array activity logs had been modified, specific operational periods removed, others altered, in a way that was technically sophisticated but not technically perfect. The modifications had preserved the metadata structure well enough to pass casual review. They had not survived a comparison against the Secretariat's own backup systems, which maintained an additional verification layer that the individuals who had altered the file apparently had not known existed. The audit report was 47 pages. Its conclusion was 4 sentences. The mission log submitted as Exhibit 14 in the Tier 1 proceeding against the United Earth Government does not match the original archived record of AFCV Meridian's operational activity. The discrepancies are consistent with deliberate modification rather than transmission error or data corruption. The original archived record does not support the sensor data attributed to AFCV Meridian in the filing. The technical audit body formally refers this matter to the Council of 9 for disciplinary review. Yara read the conclusion, set it down, and went to the viewport. Earth was there as it always was. The Terminator line moving west. Dawn crossing somewhere. She thought about what came next, not with satisfaction, because she understood that what had just been confirmed was not a victory so much as the opening of a much larger and more complicated process. A Tier 1 proceeding reversed was one thing. A finding that Accord members had conspired to fabricate evidence using official compliance infrastructure was something of a different order entirely. The Accord had been built on the premise that its legal framework was trustworthy, that the charter meant what it said, that the institutional structures its members had agreed to were not merely tools to be used against whoever was inconvenient. Someone had broken that. And humanity, barely 2 decades into Accord membership, still learning the shape of the galaxy it had entered, was the one holding the evidence. She had not wanted this. She had wanted it to be simpler. Clear records, clean reversal, restoration of Earth's standing. What they had instead was a fracture running through the Accord's credibility, and no good answer for who would have to deal with what came out of it. The audit report was classified for exactly 9 hours. Then it appeared on the same public broadcast band that the original Tier 1 violation notice had used: simultaneously decoded, simultaneously distributed, simultaneously available to every registered species network in the galaxy. This time, no one had to guess who was responsible for the broadcast. The routing signature traced to a Solundi diplomatic terminal on Threshold Prime, and the Solundi representative, a measured, precise diplomat named Counselor Ressa, released a brief formal statement confirming she had authorized it. The Charter's transparency provisions, she stated, were designed to ensure that proceedings conducted in the name of Accord members cannot be concealed from those members when they involve fundamental institutional integrity. The audit findings constitute information that all member states have a right to receive. I have provided it. The Veth, Draven and Marin representatives immediately filed a formal protest, characterizing the release as a procedural violation and demanding Ressa's suspension from Council activities. The protest required 4 Council votes to activate. They received 2. What followed was not, by any dramatic standard, spectacular. There were no fleet movements, no ultimatums delivered across starship bridges, no single confrontation that resolved everything cleanly. What there was, instead, was the slow, consequential machinery of an interstellar institution discovering that it had been used in a way its framers had not intended and struggling, with the particular awkwardness of any large bureaucratic body, to respond in a way consistent with its own stated values. The Council of 9 convened an emergency session. Yara watched the public portions through the diplomatic feed relay, the formal statements, the procedural motions, the careful political language that said serious things in measured cadences. She had analysts parsing each statement in real time, tracking the positions of every council member, noting shifts and silences. The Theron and Solundi representatives called for a full disciplinary investigation into the Frontier Compliance Division's founding and conduct. The Veth representative argued that the audit findings were disputed and that the proper course was a secondary review. Another process, another delay, more time. The Draven representative had gone quiet. Their public statements had become shorter, more careful, and the shift in register was visible to anyone paying attention. The Draven were calculating, Yara assessed, not defending the position so much as evaluating the cost of continued association with it. The Marin Confederacy's formal recusal from the proceeding had, in the wake of the audit findings, acquired new weight. The recusal had been filed before the audit was complete, which meant whoever had authorized it had known or suspected what the audit would find. They had chosen institutional distance over solidarity with the Veth and Draven charging parties. It was not innocence. It was not cooperation. But it was a crack. On the 7th day of the council session, the Draven representative requested a private consultation with the Theron and Solundi representatives. This was reported through diplomatic backchannels rather than official feeds, but by this point Earth's diplomatic team had developed a working relationship with the Theron mission that provided reliable access to non-public developments. Lieutenant Malik brought the report to Yara's attention with the careful neutrality of someone who understood its potential significance. The Draven want to talk, she said, to the 2 members most likely to push for a full investigation. Without the Veth in the room. Yes. Yara thought about that. They're looking for a way out that doesn't require them to publicly reverse their position on the violation. That's my read. What do they have to offer? The Compliance Division's founding documentation. The original internal proposal, the one that would predate the public chartering record. If the Draven were involved in the division's creation, they'd have access to communications that show the intent behind it. Malik paused. It's also possible they're looking to provide testimony about the Veth's role specifically. Separate themselves from the part they're most exposed on. Yara understood the calculus. In any conspiracy of this kind, if that was what this was, the first party to provide meaningful cooperation with an investigation generally received the most favorable treatment. The Draven were smart enough to recognize that the Marin's recusal had already signaled a willingness to create distance. If the Marin were talking to investigators independently, Draven cooperation became more urgent, not less. We don't pursue the Draven directly, she said. That's the Theron's conversation to facilitate. Our role is to make sure the evidentiary record we've built is complete enough that any testimony from a secondary party can be corroborated independently. She paused. We can't look like we're managing this investigation. We're the victim of the filing. We stay in that position. And if they try to negotiate a settlement? Withdrawal of charges, reparations, some kind of face-saving resolution that doesn't require a full public accounting. Yara was quiet for a moment. A settlement that makes our legal position whole is insufficient, she said carefully. We were charged publicly on a public broadcast band, with crimes that don't exist in our operational record. The species that received that broadcast deserve to know what the audit found. Not as a hostile act toward the Accord, but because the Accord's credibility depends on its members trusting that the compliance infrastructure can't be weaponized. She let that settle. We're not asking the Accord to punish itself. We're asking it to demonstrate that it functions. The independent investigation into the Frontier Compliance Division was formally authorized on the 12th day of the Council session, with 6 of the 9 members in support. The VETH representative cast a dissenting vote and immediately filed a constitutional challenge to the investigation's scope. The challenge was reviewed and dismissed within 48 hours. The investigative body, assembled from legal and technical specialists representing 4 neutral Accord member species, began its work quietly and moved with the kind of deliberate speed that suggested its members understood both the stakes and the scrutiny. Earth was not formally part of the investigation. They were the initiating party, the entity whose counter-evidence had triggered the process, but the investigation was an Accord internal matter, conducted under Accord authority, aimed at Accord institutions. Yara found this appropriate. It was also, she recognized, important to maintain carefully. There was a version of this situation in which Earth pushed too hard, positioned itself too centrally, used the political moment to extract advantages that went beyond the original proceeding. She had seen the analysis from Earth's diplomatic corps, the Kepler corridor patrol rights, the trade corridor access, the fleet reduction demand that had been part of the original sanction. All of it could theoretically be leveraged. She had sent a clear recommendation to the UEG diplomatic leadership. Do not. The case they had built was strong because it was clean. Because it was grounded in evidence, constrained to the specific allegations, and presented through institutional channels rather than political pressure. The moment Earth began using the proceeding for strategic gain beyond its stated claims, it changed the character of what they were doing. And beyond the tactical considerations, it was simply wrong. The Accord had been used against humanity through a corrupt mechanism. The appropriate response was to expose and correct the mechanism, not to use the resulting political leverage to become the kind of actor that had just tried to use the mechanism against them. The recommendation was accepted. Amara Solis testified before the investigative body on the 15th day. She presented her sensor data in person, a 7-hour technical session that was, by all accounts, the least dramatic and most consequential testimony of the entire proceeding. She explained her instruments, her methodology, her calibration records, and the physical impossibility of the Longwatch vessels being in 2 locations simultaneously. She answered every technical challenge with the patient precision of someone who had spent 14 months being professionally bored and could account for every minute of it. At the end of her testimony, the investigating body's lead technical assessor asked her a single question that was not on the prepared list. Dr. Solis, during your 14 months of continuous observation, did you detect anything in the Kepler corridor that you found anomalous, outside your stellar formation research? Amara paused. Yes, she said. On 2 occasions, I detected propulsion signatures consistent with a vessel running minimal identification signal at the edge of my sensor range. I logged them as unidentified traffic and noted them in my research record as interference events. She pulled up the log entries. I didn't investigate further because it wasn't my mandate. The propulsion signatures, when analyzed, were consistent with a Frontier compliance vessel. Not AFCV Meridian. A different vessel, one whose registration record, when the investigating body pulled it, showed no authorized mission to the Kepler corridor, no territorial deployment notice, and a power consumption record that showed several extended periods of long-range sensor activity during the precise windows when the alleged incidents were supposed to have been documented. The investigation had found what it was looking for. Not because Earth had led them to it. Because Amara Solis had been meticulous enough and bored enough to record everything. The formal ruling of the Council of 9 was issued on the 31st day of the proceeding. It was read aloud in the council chamber on Threshold Prime by the senior administrative officer, a ceremonial function that had not been invoked for a full reading in over 60 years, reserved for rulings of sufficient institutional weight to require the complete public record rather than a distributed summary. The chamber held representatives of 41 member species. The feed was broadcast on every registered Accord network. Yara watched it from UHQ Orbital, alone in her office, with a cup of cold coffee she had forgotten to drink. The ruling was long. She had expected that. The council had crafted it carefully, not because the facts were ambiguous, the audit had resolved that, but because the implications were significant enough to require precision in every word. It found, first, that the Tier 1 violation charges against the United Earth government were without factual basis and were hereby formally dismissed in their entirety. All provisional sanctions were rescinded. Earth's trade corridor access, patrol fleet size, and accord standing were restored to their pre-filing status. It found, second, that evidence submitted by the Accord Frontier Compliance Division in support of the charges had been materially falsified, that sensor data attributed to AFCV Meridian had been fabricated, that the operational records of a second unidentified compliance vessel showed unauthorized covert surveillance activity in the Kepler corridor, and that the founding and operational conduct of the Frontier Compliance Division represented a systematic abuse of Accord compliance. Infrastructure. It found, third, and this was the section that had taken the most careful drafting, that 3 named senior officials of the Frontier Compliance Division and 2 officials of the VETH Sovereignty's diplomatic mission to the Accord were referred for formal disciplinary proceedings under the Charter's anti-corruption statutes. The individuals were named. The specific charges were listed. The process would take time, but the referral was binding. The VETH Sovereignty's government issued a statement within the hour, characterizing the named officials as acting without authorization and announcing their immediate suspension from all governmental functions pending the disciplinary process. The statement was carefully worded to suggest the actions had been individual rather than institutional. Whether that was true was, in Yara's assessment, an open question that the disciplinary proceedings would eventually address. The Draven Collective had, as anticipated, provided cooperative testimony to the investigating body during the proceeding. Their formal representative to the Accord filed a statement acknowledging that Draven officials had been aware of the Frontier Compliance Division's formation and had provided financial support to its early operational budget, characterizing this as routine multilateral cooperation rather than involvement in the fabrication scheme. The Council's ruling noted the Draven's cooperation without endorsing the characterization. The ruling's 4th section was the one that had not been anticipated. It established, effective immediately, a mandatory technical verification protocol for all Tier 1 violation filings, requiring that sensor and navigational data submitted as evidence be independently authenticated against the Accord's own registry backups before provisional sanctions could be activated. It extended the provisional sanction delay period from 72 hours to 30 days. And it created a standing independent oversight body for compliance division activities, with representation from 6 neutral member species, empowered to audit compliance operations without prior notice. The Article 77 mechanism had not been dismantled, but it had been constrained. Yara read the 4th section twice. The Accord had not simply resolved the proceeding. It had used the proceeding to fix something that had been broken, or more precisely, something that had been usable as a weapon, in its own institutional structure. The species that had filed the violation had inadvertently made the case for the reform they most wanted to prevent. Admiral Quan Sungjin sent her a single-line message when the ruling was complete. 30 days instead of 72 hours. That's worth more than the verdict. She agreed. The public response was harder to assess. Within the Accord's member species, the ruling generated a range of reactions that Yara's diplomatic team catalogued with methodical care over the following weeks. The species most distant from the Kepler corridor and the territorial politics surrounding it, those with no direct stake in humanity's patrol rights or trade access, were, broadly speaking, respectful of the evidentiary process and the institutional reform that followed. Several smaller member species issued formal statements expressing support for the verification protocol, noting that they had previously been subject to Tier 1 proceedings that they considered to have been unfair. The Accord had a history that predated humanity by millennia, and not all of that history was characterized by the dispassionate application of its stated principles. Among the species directly involved in the corridor's territorial politics, the response was more complicated. The VETH Sovereignty's government was managing a domestic crisis. The named officials were prominent enough that their suspension was front-page news on VETH homeworld networks, generating the kind of political turbulence that accompanies institutional exposure in any civilization. The VETH public, by the accounts Earth's diplomatic corps could access, was not uniformly supportive of what the named officials had done. There was a distinction, culturally, between aggressive territorial advocacy and the fabrication of criminal charges against another member species, and the VETH, as an old civilization with a long institutional memory, understood what the latter implied about the former. The Draven Collective was quieter. Their cooperation with the investigation had purchased a degree of political cover, But the question of how far their involvement extended was not resolved by a statement characterizing it as routine budget support. The disciplinary proceedings would continue for months. Yara expected that the full picture would be substantially more complex than any party's current characterization. She was not inclined to pursue it directly. That was the Accord's work now. 3 weeks after the ruling, Amara Solis sent Yara an unofficial message through a personal channel. It was brief, characteristic of someone whose professional correspondence tended to be exhaustive and whose personal communication tended toward the minimal. It read, "My stellar nursery data is still the most interesting thing that came out of 14 months in the Kepler corridor. The formation event is proceeding within 3% of my projected timeline. I've submitted the primary findings to the Accord's Joint Science Registry. Thought you'd want to know the mission wasn't entirely about us." Yara read it 3 times. Then she sent it to Admiral Kwan with a note. "The scientist is right." Kwan's response, "They usually are." The expanded patrol rights application for the Kepler corridor, the one that had, apparently, precipitated the entire proceeding, was still under review. Earth had not withdrawn it and had not pushed to expedite it. The diplomatic position, as Yara had recommended and the UEG had accepted, was to let the review process proceed on its own timeline without leveraging the outcome of the proceeding. This was not passivity. It was a deliberate signal. The Accord was watching how humanity handled the aftermath. Not just what they had done during the proceeding, but what they did with the position they now occupied. A species that had successfully exposed institutional corruption and then immediately used that exposure as a bargaining chip would send one kind of signal to the 40 other member species. A species that returned to the ordinary process and waited its turn would send another. Earth was 20 years old in this civilization. The relationships being built now, with the Theron, with the Solundi, with the dozen smaller member species watching from a distance, were relationships being built over decades and generations. Yara had said as much in her post-proceeding report to the UEG Security Council. "We did not win a case. We demonstrated how we behave under pressure, when we believe we have been wronged, when we have evidence others do not." Every species in the Accord watched that demonstration. What they concluded about us, about our competence, our restraint, our commitment to the institutional framework we agreed to join, will shape how we are treated for the next 50 years. The proceeding was the short-term matter. The reputation it created is the long-term one. We should be careful with it. The Security Council had read it. They had not replied. She took that as agreement. Counselor Adeth sent a formal communication to Earth's diplomatic mission on the 38th day after the ruling. It was, by Theron standards, warm, a cultural register that in human terms translated roughly to the tone of a respected senior colleague acknowledging a junior one's serious work. It said, among other things, "The verification protocol will be difficult to implement and will face continued resistance from parties who preferred the previous system. Your mission's evidence is the reason it exists. I wanted you to know that this is understood, and that it is not forgotten." Yara read it at her desk, early in the morning, with the Earth turning outside the viewport as it always did. She thought about what it meant to exist inside a structure built by others, to navigate rules written before your species knew there was a galaxy to navigate in, to be judged by standards you had agreed to without fully understanding, to discover that those standards could be turned against you by parties who understood them better. And to respond, not by abandoning the structure, but by insisting that it function as designed. That was in the end what the evidence had shown. Not that humanity was exceptional. Not that humans were uniquely capable or uniquely virtuous or uniquely anything. The evidence had shown that a group of human scientists, military officers and diplomats had done their jobs thoroughly, documented everything, kept their institutional commitments and trusted that the truth, presented clearly enough, would be recognized. Sometimes it wasn't. History was full of examples. This time it had been. She wrote a reply to Counselor Adeth that was 3 sentences long. She thanked her for her role in the proceeding. She said she hoped the verification protocol would prove durable. She said Earth looked forward to a continued working relationship. She sent it. Then she went to get breakfast because the day was beginning and there was work to do. 6 months after the ruling, Earth's Interstellar Relations Bureau published an internal assessment document, classified at the diplomatic tier, distributed to senior government and military leadership, not intended for public release. It was released anyway 3 weeks later, through the same unofficial channels that had carried the Meridian's logs. Yara suspected, without being able to confirm, that the release was not accidental. Someone in the Bureau had decided the public deserved to understand what the Accord proceeding had actually meant. The document was 40 pages. Its executive summary was 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph described the proceedings' formal outcome: dismissal of charges, sanctions rescinded, institutional reforms enacted, disciplinary proceedings ongoing. The second paragraph described what the proceeding had revealed about the Accord's internal politics, the degree to which territorial and economic interests shaped the behavior of member states, the vulnerability of compliance mechanisms to coordinated manipulation, the variation in institutional integrity across a 41-member body spanning 4,000 years and dozens of fundamentally different political traditions. The third paragraph described what the proceeding had revealed about Earth's own position, that humanity, barely 2 decades into Accord membership, had been targeted precisely because it was new enough to be considered manageable, unfamiliar with the political terrain, without long-standing alliances, without the accumulated relationships that made established members difficult to isolate. The assessment was direct. The filing had been a calculated test of whether Earth could be contained. The fourth paragraph was the one that people remembered. The question the proceeding answered was not whether the charges were true. They were not. The question it answered was whether Earth, confronted with a sophisticated legal attack by more experienced Accord members, would respond with competence, restraint, and institutional fidelity, or whether it would panic, overreach, or collapse into the kind of defensive posturing that would have confirmed every concern other species have about a young, militarily capable civilization entering a complex governance structure. We responded correctly. Not brilliantly, correctly. We used the system as designed. We documented, we filed, we waited, we proved. The Accord's own mechanisms eventually produced the accurate outcome. This is not a guaranteed result. It required the active cooperation of neutral council members who chose institutional integrity over political convenience, and it required a Theron jurist who had spent 30 years caring enough about the Charter to be angry when it was misused. We should understand clearly that we were fortunate in those alignments, and that future situations may not produce them. Yara read the document in her office and thought about the word correctly. It was the right word. It was also an uncomfortable one. There was no version of the past 6 months that felt like victory in the way that word was usually understood. Too much had been lost in the interim. Not materially, the sanctions had been rescinded before they fully activated, but in terms of the relationships and assumptions that the proceeding had revealed. The Accord was not the institution Earth had imagined joining. Or rather, it was that institution, but it was also all the things that coexist with good institutional intentions in any sufficiently large and old political structure. Self-interest operating through legitimate mechanisms. Power asymmetries that the formal charter language papered over. The gap between what a system was designed to do and what it was sometimes used to do. None of this was surprising in retrospect. Humans understood this dynamic intimately. Earth's own international institutions, the ones that had evolved through the brutal political history of the 20th and 21st centuries, had the same character. The United Nations had been simultaneously a forum for genuine multilateral cooperation and a stage for geopolitical maneuvering. The international court system had produced landmark rulings on human rights and had also been ignored when powerful states found its conclusions inconvenient. These were not reasons to abandon the institutions. They were reasons to understand them clearly. The Accord was the same. Older, stranger, operating across scales that made Earth's political experience feel preliminary, but recognizably the same kind of thing. Yara had written this, or something like it, in her contribution to the Bureau's assessment. She had also written something she had not included in the official document, because it was personal and imprecise and not the kind of thing that belonged in a classified diplomatic assessment. She had written it in her private log at 0200 on the night the ruling came through, when she was alone and the Earth was turning outside and the coffee was cold again. I keep thinking about what we actually built over these 6 months. Not the legal case. The case was built from Amara's data, from Longwatch's logs, from the Accord's own registry. We didn't manufacture anything. We just assembled what existed. What we built was something harder to describe. A demonstration of what we do when we believe we're right but can't prove it yet. Do we shout? Do we threaten? Do we find shortcuts? We didn't. We waited, we documented, we used channels that existed for this purpose, we found allies who cared about the same things we cared about, and we presented evidence and then let other people do what they were going to do with it. That's not heroism. That's just competence under pressure. But I think it might be the most important thing we've done since we signed the Charter. Not what we proved but how we proved it. Other species watched. The Accord has a long memory. What they saw us do in the worst months of our membership so far, is what they'll expect us to do in the future. We have to be worth that expectation. The Kepler Corridor Patrol rights were approved 14 months after the ruling. The vote was 7-2. The Veth and Draven delegations voted against, but the Veth's vote was, by then, a formality. Their political standing within the council had contracted significantly during the disciplinary proceedings, which had ultimately produced formal censure of 2 of the 3 named officials and a binding requirement for an independent audit of Veth diplomatic mission operations. The Draven's vote against was similarly noted without surprise. Their internal political situation was still evolving, and their relationship with Earth would take years to resolve into something functional. The 7 votes in favor included the Theron, the Solundi, and 5 member species that had not been publicly prominent in the proceeding but whose diplomatic liaisons had, over the intervening months, developed working relationships with Earth's attaché office. Small species, some of them. Old members who had been in the Accord long enough to have accumulated their own experiences with Article 77's misuse. They had watched the proceeding carefully. They had made their assessments. Earth's expanded patrol presence in the Kepler corridor was authorized under stricter protocols than the original application had requested: mandatory position reporting at shorter intervals, a joint observation agreement with the Theron mission, and a standing invitation for neutral Accord observers to accompany any Kepler-designated patrol. Earth had agreed to all 3 conditions without negotiation. Admiral Kwan had reviewed the conditions before the vote and told Yara they were reasonable. "We can operate transparently," he said. "We have nothing to hide. That's not why we agreed." "I know." He looked at the star chart with the corridor marked in green and the new patrol boundaries marked in blue. "We agreed because the Accord's observers being present makes it harder for anyone to make claims about what we're doing in there that our own logs can't refute." "Yes. So it's both." "Usually is." Amara Solis was assigned to the first patrol mission into the expanded Kepler corridor, not as a military asset, but as the scientific lead for an observation program that had been proposed by the Theron and jointly staffed by Earth and 4 other member species. The program would study KIC 7341's formation progress over the next decade, producing data that would be shared across the Accord Science Registry under open access protocols. Her equipment was better this time. Her mandate was the same. She sent Yara a message before departure. Brief as usual. "The formation event is at 34% of projected cycle. It'll be the most complete stellar nursery observation in Accord scientific history. Thought you might like to know that the reason we're allowed back in the corridor produced something worth the trouble." Yara read it twice, then sent back, "Document everything." Amara's reply: "I always do." The disciplinary proceedings concluded 2 years after the ruling. 3 of the 5 referred individuals received formal censure and permanent removal from Accord-affiliated positions. 2 received conditional censure, acknowledged responsibility combined with a finding that their involvement was less direct than the primary architects of the scheme. The Frontier Compliance Division was dissolved and its mandates redistributed to the standing oversight body that the verification protocol had created. The Veth Sovereignty's government survived the political turbulence, though the political landscape on their homeworld had shifted in ways that would take a generation to fully resolve. The individuals who had authorized the filing, not the named officials, but whoever above them had made the strategic decision that Earth could be contained through a fabricated legal case, were never formally identified. Whether they existed as a coherent decision-making group, or whether the scheme had emerged through the alignment of separate interests rather than centralized planning, remained an open question. Yara had her own assessment. She kept it to herself. She left active duty 3 years after the ruling. Not because she was asked to, not because the work was finished, the work was never finished, but because she had spent 11 years at UHQ Orbital and the time felt complete in the way that certain things do when you've done what you came to do without being entirely sure what that was until you'd done it. She went back to Accra. The city was different from her childhood. Larger, quieter in some ways and louder in others, the ocean still there and the horizon still appearing to be the edge of everything when you stood at the waterline in the early morning. She walked along the coast on her first week back and tried to put the past 6 months of the proceeding into some kind of proportion with the rest of her life, with the city around her, with the ordinary continuity of a world that had been going about its business during the entire time she had been in orbit trying to preserve the legal standing of the species that lived on it. She wasn't sure she managed it. The scale was too different. The Kepler corridor was 90 light-years away. The Accord chamber on Threshold Prime was 3 months of travel from Sol. The species she had spoken to through encrypted diplomatic channels were biological constructs so different from human biology that the fact of communication across that difference still seemed remarkable when she thought about it directly. And yet, the problems had been recognizable. The strategies had been familiar. The institutional maneuvering, the political calculation, the gap between stated principles and operational practice. All of it had the character of something humanity had spent centuries learning to navigate in its own governance structures. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the most useful thing humanity had brought to the Accord was not its technology, not its military capacity, not its particular history or biology, but its accumulated experience with being new to a system designed by others, and learning to work within that system without losing its capacity to hold the system accountable. She sat on a bench near the waterline and watched the Atlantic moving in the early light. Someone sat down beside her. A young woman, student age, who had apparently recognized her. The proceeding had been public enough that Yara's name was known, and was working up to saying something. "I watched the whole thing," the young woman said finally. "Every session that was broadcast. My whole family did." Yara looked at her. "What did you think?" The young woman thought about it seriously, which Yara appreciated. "I thought, it wasn't what I expected. I thought it would be more dramatic. I thought someone would make a speech or threaten something or..." She paused. "It was just a lot of very careful people doing very careful work for a very long time." "Yes. Is that what it's actually like? Out there?" Yara looked at the ocean. The horizon still appeared to be the edge of everything. "Most of the time," she said. "The dramatic moments exist. But they're usually the result of a lot of very careful people doing a lot of very careful work beforehand." She paused. "The galaxy is old and complicated and full of species who have been navigating it far longer than we have. We don't win by being spectacular. We win by being thorough." The young woman nodded slowly. "That's less exciting than the stories," she said. "Yes," Yara agreed. "It is." She watched the ocean. "It's also true," she said. "Which is the part that matters."